And so you grow up a little bit and you go, all right, it's not my thing, but I'm glad that it's your thing. And then you encounter this boundary problem with pluralism, right? You encounter this thing where people are trying to make you eat onions. And that doesn't work out very well, does it? Right? The thing is, we discover edges. We discover healthy boundaries in our pluralism. I love peanut butter, but I can't make you eat it. In fact, for some of you, I would kill you if I made you eat peanut butter, if you have a sensitive tree nut allergy. So we have to figure out how we go about in this world with what we like and what you like, and at the same time setting those boundaries. And that's really what the hymn we just sang was about. My country's skies are so blue, our trees are so green, we're the best, but also so is yours, right? How do we live in that space where we're juggling both? I've been thinking about onions a lot, strangely enough, because I've had the pleasure of teaching the Journey to Membership classes where I'm a ministerial intern. So these are folks that have been visiting and going, I think I'd like to become a member. Now not all, but most of the folks in that class are, like myself, what we call religious migrants. I grew up in one kind of religious experience. For me, it felt a little bit like raw onions. No thanks, I don't like this anymore. And then I found my peanut butter faith. And we experience this a lot. It's not everyone, but a lot of folks that are finding you have left something else. So when I ask someone in this class, tell me what you love about Unitarian Universalism, sometimes I get a negative definition. What I love about being a UU is that it's not X. X is whatever you were before you were UU, right? And then they'll follow with, because here, unlike that systematic theology that said who's good and who's bad, here, you can believe whatever you want. And so let's take the two claims in that bit by bit. Saying that you love Unitarian Universalism because it's not the other thing is not the best way to sell what Unitarian Universalism is. That's like saying, what I love about peanut butter, it doesn't taste at all like onions. There's better ways to sell it. Here's my elevator speech for peanut butter in case you want it. Sweet, salty, umami, high protein, high good fats, right? Unless it's not your thing. But defining Unitarian Universalism as not X doesn't really help anyone understand what we are. So sometimes Unitarian Universalists will use this three-word phrase to say who we are. Deeds, not creeds. Have you heard it? Deeds, not creeds. And that's really succinct. It says we show up in the world for our values instead of memorizing 3 paragraphs from 1700 years ago, right? We show up with that. But that's very different than saying you can believe whatever you want. We are a covenantal denomination. We covenant to one another. As a member here, I'm in a covenantal relationship with you all. And so we first articulated that in the 1960s with 6 principles. We came back to it in the 80s and we said, let's add a 7th principle. And we just came back to it again this summer. And now what it looks like, if Jack can show this is what we covenant to in our own lives and in community. We covenant to put love at the center of everything we do. And we'll show up in the world with our justice, our interdependence, our equity, our transformation, our pluralism, and our generosity. We covenant to those things. So the believe whatever you want piece falls short if someone said, what I love about being a Unitarian Universalist is I can believe whatever I want. For example, I believe that redheads are actually Martians who are trying to brainwash us all. And so it is my belief that we need to export all of the redheads back to Mars. No offense. And that's out of covenant with what we...
This planet? Like, why wouldn't I want to leave?
and that is out of covenant. It does not put love at the center. It is not pluralism. It is not interdependence, right? What that is, that claim that redheads are Martians, is contempt. That claim is a claim of contempt. And what I mean by contempt is a kind of anger that is flat. It's a two-dimensional, contourless caricature of an entire population, or an entire nation, or an entire religious tradition, or an entire way of being. It is a flat way to talk about it. You feel that contempt. For example, if you're meeting someone who's from another country and they say, "Oh, you're an American?" Yes, I am. Well, then you must love guns and pollution and predator drones and prisons, and right? And you're going, no, we're more complicated than that. I think I understand how you got that impression, but we're more contoured than that. We're more textured than that. That's what that contempt would feel like, is to be flattened into a two-dimensional, disposable kind of cartoon. What I had in my childhood was a flat contempt for onions. Any kind of onion, any way, I didn't want it. What my journey to membership friend was expressing was a sort of a passive contempt for the previous religious tradition. No thanks, it's all the same. Right? I would just use an example of contempt for redheads. Contempt is always out of covenant with love at the center. But boy, is contempt easier. Have you tried to put love at the center for an entire workday? I didn't make it to lunch. I mean, to be perfectly honest, putting love at the center is much harder. If we had articulated values of naps and snacks, we would have 50 million members. But putting love at the center is a hard covenant, because contempt comes so much easier. Contempt comes so quickly. And so let's take a moment in the compassionate bravery of our communal gathering here to get to know your contempt. In this loving space, I want you to think of something or someone who makes you immediately angry and dismissive. Someone you know, someone in the news, some political party, some religious tradition, and I want you to just sit in the feeling for a moment. What is at the center of your contempt? What is the feeling beneath the feeling of contempt you're experiencing? Take a moment. It is hard to carry your contempt every day in this multicultural world. Eventually, you will find yourself in relationship with people or experiences that don't fit your two-dimensional cartoon. You'll arrive at a cognitive dissonance that you can't square your flat cartoon with the textured reality of the person in front of you. I had an ancestor, who I hope will forgive me for sharing this, who had that sort of what I would describe as like late 1950s remarkably specific prejudices, where she would say things like, well, of course you can't trust Polish people, but Jim Wachowski, he's a good man, he's a good one. You might have had an ancestor like that. So I'm sitting there as a child going, so all of the Polish diaspora is a flat, untrustworthy cartoon, but the one Polish man you know is a good person? Like, how many Polish people would this person have to encounter to free her from that prejudice? I asked myself, what is a quorum of the good ones that would change your mind? Likewise, if you meet enough Americans, you'll discover that many of us, in fact, aren't huge fans of guns and prisons and predator drones and pollution. Hopefully, we show up in our deeds regularly enough to show that we're pushing back, living out our values. And to bring it back to onions, which is where your heart has been, I discovered something in adulthood, and I want to let you in on this. It's a secret. If you dice the onions small enough and then cook them in butter or oil, they caramelize. Nobody told me this. That's delicious. Caramelized onions make a stew pop. They're necessary for a good soup or a chili or a stir fry. When I was cooking dinner, I became an advocate, dare I say, for caramelized onions. Raw onions, I'm still going to hold my healthy boundary on. No, thank you. But caramelized onions, I didn't even know such a thing was possible. And it forced me to sit with my flat contempt for onions. That's a metaphor, right? Just naming it. onions were on my mind in seminary when my UU colleagues and I discovered that in order to be a Unitarian Universalist minister, you have to take multiple courses in the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Gospels and the Christian epistles and the history of Christianity. And for a lot of us, we'd sort of scratch our heads and go, why? Like, have you been to our services? Have you seen a sermon recently exegeting this pericope from the Gospel of Matthew? Why would we need to take these classes? Well, of course, the professors were ready for this. It's not like we were the first class to go, why do I have to take these classes? And their answers have stuck with me and contoured my flat experience. The first one is they said, know your history. Unitarians and Universalists have for centuries been Christian. Right? The chalice was a cruciform shape. Know your history. They were always Protestant. They were considered heretics by other denominations, but they identified with, oriented themselves around Jesus, God, and Spirit. And you should know that. And in fact, if you look across to our sister congregations around the world, the Transylvanian Unitarians, it's a Christian denomination. And the Filipino Universalists, it's Christian denominations, right? And so you can see it's a church service. So know your history. The second thing they said was know your present. Yes, we all in America are swimming in Christianity waters. If you're going to work in your community, you need to learn how to swim. And then they said, know your future. If you're going to show up with your deeds in interfaith justice work, that can't work if you have a flat contempt for 2.4 billion people. And that chastened us a little bit, but what really stuck out was in a different class when one of my colleagues had made a sort of a flat contempt, off-the-cuff joke like, well, back when I was a kid and I believed in leprechauns and God, ha ha ha. And this black Unitarian Universalist professor said, I want to stop you right there. And I want you to know that every time you make a joke against Christianity, you're insulting my mom and my dad and my grandparents and my siblings and actually every black person I know. So if you're going to commit yourself to this anti-racist multicultural work that you keep saying you're going to do, you should probably stop such a flat contempt. Yeah, that was the silence that we experienced, even on Zoom. It stuck. It stuck. Well, a lot of us like data, so I went into the Pew Religious Landscape Survey from 2021, and 97% of African Americans identify as believing in God, 75% of Latinos, 45% of Unitarian Universalists. It's contoured. It's contoured, right? And so we had to really sit with that for a minute. So off we went chastened, and we studied the Hebrew Bible and the Christian texts and the history of the diaspora of Christianities. And you know what? I experienced a very similar revelation, awareness, as I did with caramelized onions. Right? It turned out that Jesus was, the experience I had in my first religious tradition was relatively raw oniony Christianity from my lived experience. But I, here in these classes, discovered a Jesus that was unambiguously working for collective liberation. Just a reminder, Jesus never said, blessed are the powerful. He said, blessed are the meek. He didn't heal the senators. He healed the homeless lepers. He didn't feed investment brokers. He fed the starving. He didn't hang out with the Romans. He was befriending day laborers. He did not preach salvation to those who pick themselves up by their bootstraps. He preached freedom for the imprisoned. He didn't preach law and order. He was talking about forgiveness of debts. What I'm saying is that you have to read Jesus' words so slant that they're upside down in order to justify using your power and your wealth and your privilege or your violence in his name. The thing is, I grew up with that sort of loving and well-intended raw onion version of Christianity, which I said no thanks to. But the deeper we got into it in seminary, the more I found a caramelized version, a Christianity that shows up at the margins, fighting for the liberation and the flourishing of all. And that, my dears, is why we were going to watch Mahalia Jackson leading an activist community in We Shall Overcome. What I'm talking about is Fannie Lou Hamer and Bayard Rustin and Reverend John Lewis and Reverend Dr. King and our own UU Reverend James Reeb, who were showing up with their deeds for civil rights, trying to find a way out of no way, walking through the valley of the shadow of death and fearing no evil because they were sure that their God desired ever-flowing streams of righteousness. And it turns out that that's the kind of caramelized onion faith that a lot of people are down with. And it is a darn shame that Jesus' teachings ever got corrupted by power and empire in the first place. I blame Constantine. What I'm saying is that our aspirational values from any sort of holy person always get turned upside down and inside out anytime power and empire get a hold of them. It would seem impossible to say that you study the teachings of the Buddha and also support ethnic cleansing, but here we are in Myanmar. I'm saying that it seems impossible to look at a UU tradition of widening the circle and square it with some of our own history. I'm talking about the Unitarians who enslaved and opposed abolition, the UU misogynists who opposed women's suffrage, the UU white supremacists who supported eugenics, and our own Unitarian Indian boarding school in Utah, the UU racists who housed KKK meetings. Our aspirational values will always get turned upside down and inside out when power and empire get a hold of them. Love at the center can very easily become contempt for the other. And so, whenever you feel that contempt for someone else or something else, that usually gets me by lunchtime, interrogate it, sit with it. Hold yourself in compassionate love and dig a little deeper into what might be going on. The values we covenant to are really hard. I'm just going to make one more pitch, naps and snacks. If we are covenanting to those values, we're going to need one another, and we're going to need our sustaining practices to keep us coming back into that circle. For me, that practice is studying the teachings of the Buddha and sitting in meditation in a Sangha. That brings me back into covenant. For a sizable portion of Unitarian Universalists, that practice is Christianity, praying to God and studying Jesus' teachings. For many Unitarian Universalists, that practice looks like reading poetry, making music, hiking in the woods, staring out at the night sky in awe and wonder. We have learned, each in our own hard ways, that pluralism requires boundaries. If someone else ever tries to legislate that you can only eat onions or that you may never eat avocados, we have to push back. But we have a lot of work ahead of us to bend the moral arc of the universe towards justice, my friends. And the only way that we'll ever get there is by working with other people who share those values and goals, including a lot of folks who cook differently. Whatever you cook with, if it's onions or peanut butter or avocado, if it keeps you centering your love and showing up for these values, keep on cooking. Maybe so.